Hi folks, Dr. Little here again. Let's move on to video lecture number 2, where we'll cover the second set of 8 stylistic devices. As you know, in video lecture number 1, we covered the first 8 devices, and now we'll cover the second 8, so it'll be those 16 devices that you should draw from when you do your first writing assignment, which is, right, to analyze a text of your choice stylistically using no fewer than 4 stylistic devices. So be sure that those 4 devices come from these first 2 video lectures. In other words, don't draw from your other courses, say other literature courses or other writing courses, and analyze a text, say through symbolism or metaphor. Don't do that, right? That will not count toward the grading rubric in this class. You'll need to draw from the 16 devices covered here. So the first 2 devices, active and passive voice, go hand in hand. And they're pretty simple, I think, in definition. Sometimes they're harder to see in actuality. So by active voice, so first of all, voice in this use of the term is a quality of each sentence. And so you'll see each independent clause has a voice in English. There is an exception, existential verbs. Existential verbs in English are is, am, are, was, and were. Now, those sentences with those verbs don't have a voice. And you'll see why as we work through these cases, because there really isn't an actor doing the action of the verb, presumably to an object in the sentence. And so, for example, of a sentence without voice would be Sacramento is the capital of California. So the verb there is existential. It's one of the 5, is, am, are, was, were. It's is in this case. And so those we will just bracket off as not having voice. But every other sentence in English will have a voice. Okay, now on to what they are. So the definition of active voice is simply a sentence where the subject of the sentence performs the action of the sentence. And the action is, located in the verb. Okay? And so let's look at a simple example. John kicked the ball. So step 1 in this case is to figure out what the action of the sentence is. And the action is in the verb. Someone's doing some kicking or something. Someone or something is kicking. Okay? Next question is, well, who or what is doing that kicking? In our example, it's John. And then the third question, and this is the pivotal question, is that who or what in the subject slot? And if the answer is yes, it's active voice, and if the answer is no, it's passive. In this case, is John in the subject slot of the sentence? Yeah, John is in the subject slot, and so this sentence is indeed active. Okay, let's go through this very same method with another sentence that is similar. You still have John kicking a ball, right? So right here we should see that active and passive voice are not qualities of the meaning of the sentence. The semantics of the sentence are identical, almost identical in this case. John is kicking the ball in both cases. Okay, so voice is not referring to semantics. It's referring to the syntactic relationship of the subject to the verb. So we'll go through the same question. What's the action of this sentence? Well, there's some kicking going on here. Who or what is doing the kicking? Well, it's still John. Now here's the pivotal question. Is John in the subject slot? This time the answer is no. And so this would be a case of passive voice. It's a dichotomy. Voice is a dichotomy, right? So whenever the voice is not active, it's by definition passive. So this X with a red sphere, yes, means it's simply not active voice, and therefore it's passive. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just not active voice. So let's look at another example. Despite his earlier criticism of 3 Mile Island, Malcolm now insists that the U.S. invests, so we don't even care what the rest of the sentence says. We stop right there. The point is, we already know that the action of the sentence is that someone or something is doing some insisting. Somebody's insisting. Who is doing that insisting? We know it's Malcolm. Is Malcolm in the subject slot? Yes. The subject slot of the sentence contains Malcolm. And so the voice of that sentence is active. Active voice, again, is when the subject does the verb of the sentence. Here's another one. Despite its controversial history, nuclear energy is now being advocated by a number of national security experts. Okay, well, somebody's doing, the action of the sentence is that somebody is advocating. Somebody's doing some advocating here. Who or what is doing that? Well, it's the national security experts are advocating. Are they in the subject slot? No. So this is not active voice. This would be passive. Okay, so active voice, again, these typical effects take with a grain of salt. Active voice is oftentimes associated with clarity, concision. Concision is just another word for being concise, succinctness, brevity, right? And responsibility focused. Now, this is interesting. Responsibility focused. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean if the sentence requires that the person or thing doing the action is in the subject slot, that means that that person or thing, the so-called agent of the action, is identified, right? Like in the above two examples above, we know who's doing the kicking and who's doing the insisting. We know because they have to be in the sentence, because they have to be in the subject slot to be active voice. And so you can't sort of abrogate responsibility by not being identified in active voice. In passive voice, you can. We could say in this case, the ball was kicked, period. Do we know who kicked it? No. That the ball was kicked is passive voice, and that allows us to leave off the agent responsible for doing the action. So that's what we mean here by responsibility focused. Okay. In general, it's oftentimes useful to write in the active voice, but that does not mean you always should. Passive voice is necessary in your writing. But yes, active voice typically leads to briefer, more clear sentences for comprehension. Okay. So now we're on to passive voice, which we almost don't need to cover because we've covered it through what is not active is therefore passive. But we'll go through it anyhow. So passive voice is any case where the subject does not perform the action of the sentence. We have our two examples from the previous term as passive voice, right? Because the ball was kicked by John. John's not in the subject slot, so it's passive. Again, second case, national security experts are not in the subject slot, and so it is passive. And you do this for a million reasons. Emphasis, yes, to put it at the end of the sentence. Correct modification. I'll get to that later with branching, okay? But be sure you remember, I hope you're taking notes, remember that voice and branching go together. They work in tandem, okay? And I'll show you what I mean by that. And as I already mentioned, that passive voice allows the evasion of responsibility because in passive voice, the agent doesn't need to be listed. In my two examples here, the agent is listed, but notice you don't need the prepositional phrase by John in that first case. And it would still be passive voice, but we wouldn't know who was doing the kicking. And we use that a lot of time when we want to ignore or neglect, right? Not identify the person in charge, right? And so we have a good use for passive voice frequently for a number of reasons. These three typical effects, chief among them, I suppose. Okay, so we have a voice down, which is a pretty simple syntactic structure, right? Next up is this notion of nominalization. Now, I'm going to give the simpler view of nominalization. There are other cases of nominalization that I'm just not going to cover. They're not going to improve your writing the way this particular brand of nominalization will, okay? So we're just going to cover the cases that regard verbs. A nominal is simply Nominalization is the process of changing a verb into a noun. A nominal is simply a noun with a verb latent within it. Or in other words, stuck inside of it. So you think about this in terms of writing. In creative writing, you want your verbs to carry much of the action of the text. And so if you're changing your verbs into nouns, in other words, objectifying them, if you're not replacing that verb that used to be the verb with another strong verb, you might get sort of weaker language, because you might turn, what happens a lot in nominalization is the strong verbs get shuttled off into the noun, and then you use existential verbs, is, am, are, was, were, in the verb slot. And so that's kind of weak, it's not the most compelling creative writing, because your action is not in the verb's form, it's in the noun. Examples would be here, back to sort of academic writing. So when you have a verb like to examine, but you've chosen to use the term examination, that's nominalization. In other words, examination is the nominal, and within the term examination is a latent verb that we could pull out, namely to examine. Same thing, substitution has the latent verbs to substitute within it. Analysis has to analyze. The list goes on forever. Let's just look at an example. Laughter in the crowd occurred after the professor presented his argument for the existence of life on Saturn. This is pretty aloof, sort of potentially pretentious language here, right? And why is that? Stylistically, it's because there are an awful lot of nominalized words in this sentence. So take a moment, maybe hit pause, and ask yourself, where are there nouns in this sentence where there are verbs latent within them? And the answer is you have several. You have laughter is serving as a noun in this sentence, but to laugh would be the verb. Crowd, to crowd. Professor, to profess. Argument, to argue. Existence, to exist. And potentially life, to live. So in a relatively short sentence, you have six nominalizations happening here, right? Now, presented is the verb in this sentence, and actually occurred is the verb. The verb of the sentence is occurred, and that's a pretty, I don't know, it's lukewarm in terms of an actionable verb. Occurred is kind of oftentimes a kind of fluff in the sentence. You need to have a verb in a sentence, and so you throw something in like occurred. It's not much far off, it's not too far off from existential verbs like am, is, are, was, were. And so the question might be, if occurred is a kind of weak verb in this sentence, how might we make this sentence more active and engaging by actually using one of the verbs locked inside the nouns as the verb of the sentence? And so instead of laughter in the crowd occurred, what could you say that gets rid of laughter? Well, you might say the crowd laughed. Now you've got laughed as the verb, right? The crowd laughed after the professor presented his argument for the existence of life on Saturn. Okay, so you've got, that's one revision you might make. So instead of laughter in the crowd occurred, you have the crowd laughed. You still have crowd acting as a nominal, but you did get rid of laughter as a nominal. Now, out of context, it's really hard to know if that revision is better. We can say it's more active in verb form. We can say it's shorter. Whether it works within the context, within the genre, we really need to look at actual cases of contextual writing to know. But that would be an example of how to flip it back and forth between how to remove a nominal from a sentence. You could also try to remove others like argument, right? You might do something like this. The crowd laughed after the professor argued that life exists on Saturn. So now you've gotten rid of laughter, argument, existence, those three. Those three nominals have been removed, and you have them serving in a different form that is typically thought of as more engaging. Okay, so the revised sentence, the one on the bottom there, only has two nominals, right? A crowd is still a nominal. Professor is still a nominal. Oh, sorry, three. And life. So we've got, so the first example has 6 nominals. The second example has 3 nominals. And so I'd suggest you read both of these sentences and think about the different quality of these two sentences. What does it mean to reduce the number of nominals in a sentence? That would be a good exercise to kind of get a sense of the nature of style in this case. Okay? Here's another one. There was an explanation by us of the evolution of the dorsal fin. Lots of nominals here. Notice that the verb is was. That's one of these existential verbs, right? Am, is, are, was, were. So that's pretty weak. Notice that the subject is also pretty weak. There. That's considered a dummy subject. There's really no antecedent to that pronoun, right? There's nothing that stands in for that there. It's just an artifice of English language that we need a subject in the sentence, and when we don't have one, we use a dummy subject like there or it. So there was an explanation by us of the evolution of the dorsal fin. Where are the nouns in this sentence that have verbs stuck inside? That's the question when you ask nominalization revision techniques. And there are at least 2. Is there a third? No. If we're just focusing on the verb to noun nominalization, there are only 2 here. Explanation and evolution. So the question for you as a writer is, maybe this sentence is fine. Maybe this is exactly how you want to write as a writer. Or maybe you're reviewing a colleague's work and the colleague is just confident in this sentence. Fine, then leave it. There's nothing wrong with this sentence grammatically. Maybe it works in the context. But as a writer, you should be able to, in your mind, identify that there are 2 obvious nominals in this sentence. And when you identify that there are these 2 nominals, you can now see points for possible revision. And that's the key. The key is to strategically revise your work. Not to just rewrite and think, oh, what does the professor want? And just try different sentences, different sentence structure. No, the key is to say, in this case, look, the most obvious place to look for revision is to get rid of one or both of these nominals. So how might we, let's use the first case, explanation. Forget explanation, make that explained, right? Make it strong as a verb. Get rid of was as the verb and put explained in there. Who's doing this explaining? Well, us, so we'll say we. So the first thing you might say is, well, let's revise this and say, we explained the evolution of the dorsal fin. That's an improvement, probably in a lot of cases. And you got rid of the nominalization explanation. And you could also look at evolution and say, well, the verb form of that is to evolve. Is there a way to write this sentence that gets rid of both nominalizations? Yeah, we explain how the dorsal fin evolved. That sentence has no nominals. The sentence above it has 2. Again, I would take a minute and just think through what are these nominals doing, right? Compare in your own mind, in your own language, the difference between these 2 sentences, and then you can start to see the effect of reducing nominals in your writing. Okay, I'm not going to spell out what I think the interpretation here is. It's really for you to decide. Okay, again, it would be a mistake to get rid of all nominals in your writing. There are times when nominals are required. The goal for this class is for you to be able to identify nominals, see them as points of revision, revise and offer yourself other candidate sentences with fewer nominals. But in the end, I can't tell you without reading your work whether that revised sentence is more effective than the initial sentence, right? So again, we're talking about conscious control of your writing. Here's another. Oh, we start off right again with that dummy subject there, and then a weak verb was. So right off the bat, you should know this sentence is potentially in trouble. There was. Well, that tells us nothing. We've used up the two of the three most important slots in a sentence, the subject and the verb. We've used them up with there was and have said absolutely nothing. Okay? Now, we've got a collision going on. Well, that's a nominal because the verb to collide is latent within it. We've got cars is a noun, but there is no verb form of that. There's no such thing as to car. Intersection, that's a nominal because you can intersect things. So take a minute. This would be a classic quiz question. I would give you this sentence, and I would say, write an effective sentence conveying this same sentiment that has 0 nominals. Okay. So take a minute, probably hit pause, rewrite this sentence, getting rid of the nominals, see what you come up with. So what I've come up with, of course, is get rid of collision, get rid of intersection. 2 cars collided where Bloor and Bathurst intersect. Bloor and Bathurst are roads in Toronto. So 2 cars collided where Bloor and Bathurst intersect. 0 nominals, shorter, very clear, lower register, probably a better revision than the upper version, but we haven't considered, again, the larger context, so we're not sure. But this would solve the question of nominals. I'm not going to go through these large examples other than to say nominalization is very common in scientific writing. There's a lot of desire in scientific writing to objectify the phenomena under study. Okay, you like to turn phenomena, even actions, into objects or nouns so that you can kind of objectify them and study them as things. Okay, and so in scientific writing you'll find tons of nominalization, and that's where if you're going to go into that work and you're going to be writing in those genres, yeah, you won't be getting rid of your nominals. You need to be aware of nominals and use them effectively in your writing. Right? So this would be, in other words, whether you're going to use highly nominalized language or not, it's useful to know what nominalization is so that you can approximate the genre that you're trying to write in better, more quickly. In the introduction of this experimental article in the Sciences, this is actually taken from a piece I teach in a different class. You can see indicated in blue are the nominals. I'm not going to go through all of them. I want to give you a sense of the prevalence of nominalization in scientific writing. And let's compare that to, say, creative writing. This was a description a former student wrote of a Buddhist monk. This was part of a screenplay that she actually presented at the Sundance Film Festival maybe 10 years ago. Notice how many nominals are here. 1. And so you can kind of see there are genre typifications or genre conventions when it comes to style to some degree. And the crude rule is that in general, creative writing has fewer nominals than academic writing, and scientific writing probably has the most nominals of all the different genres of nonfiction prose. Okay. As I've already mentioned, some of the effects of nominalization are to objectify the phenomena under study, make them objects by turning actions into nouns. You also increase the register, register is the device we're talking about next, and it simply refers to the formality of your writing. And so I hope you can see, for example, that this sentence reads with a higher level of formality than does this sentence. And so those would be some of the reasons you would heavily nominalize your language. On to register. As I said, register is simply the level of formality associated with a word or a phrase. There is a continuum of formality for register. I'll be more simpler in this presentation and just talk about kind of categorizing them as low register and high register for the point of for the sake of teaching the material. But in reality, there's a middle register, and this is all on a qualitative continuum. Low register words are like can't, because it's a contraction. Almost any contraction is considered low register. It's kind of informal. Skinny, sad and lonely, kid, fake, saying, brainy. This is street talk, right? This is sort of easygoing, colloquial English. Their coordinate high register forms would be cannot instead of can't, right? Slender instead of skinny, forlorn instead of sad and lonely. You get the idea here. And register is something that's important to be aware of in your own writing, of course, because typically what you want to do in nonfiction writing is, except for creative exceptions, you want to maintain a similar register. You're going to write a piece, and in the first paragraph or two, you're going to create, whether you know it or not, a convention for the reader. You're going to be writing in a certain register, and that reader, whether consciously or not, is going to build that as an expectation. So when you suddenly shift register, because you're not consciously aware of it when you're writing, it usually leads to a breakdown to some degree of the reading experience. And the readers might say something like, oh, the writing wasn't very consistent, or it kind of fell off at the end, or I just didn't like their writing, and they won't really know why. But sometimes that's because the register just shifted and caused a lack of continuity for no particular reason. So when in doubt, maintain a consistent register in your writing, and change the register, which is called register shift, for strategic, creative purposes. A brief historical context to lay over this notion of register, and that is, owing to the development of English over the last 800 years, we can somewhat predict the historical origins of our modern English words via register. So English began with its Old English core, which came primarily from Germanic tribes, right? And so today, about a third of our modern English comes from that Old English core. And a surprisingly high number of those words are single syllable, kind of guttural, simple words that come from that Germanic tribe origin, like friend, hard, land, lust, sleep, life. You get the idea here. Now, over time, as English evolved, people realized, as complex society increased or grew, people realized that the Old English core wasn't sufficient to communicate needs in complex society, and so they started borrowing from other languages that they were in contact with, right? And so they borrowed from the French, largely for administrative lexicon, and from classical antiquity, from Latin and Greek, for much of their academic work. And so if you look again at modern English, you'll see roughly a third, well, a little less than a third, of our English comes from that early Germanic tribe, or early Germanic languages. Another third comes from the French, and another, just under a third, from the Latin and the Greek. And so, and typically, not always, but the French aligns with more of the administrative work language, and the classical antiquity languages align with our philosophical, academic, scientific language. And these, this largely corresponds with issues of register, right? The Old English core is low register, and the French, Latin, and Greek are higher register. And so here's a kind of comparison across the board. You can see, I'll just use the two examples, right? So you have that low register Germanic core, which would be like scare. Higher register in the French would be frighten. Higher register in the Latin and Greek would be terrify. The bottom example is another good one. You've got single syllable, low register, thin, versus the French or the Latin Greek, gaunt and emaciated. And so This is something you really need to pay attention to, right, in your own writing, and it's especially important or more redolent in creative writing, where you're really working with different sensibilities in diction, right? In diction, for, creative writing is less codified in diction than academic writing, and so you convey a lot. You can convey a lot about for example, a character in a story through the register of the dialogue associated with that character. Here's an example from an actual Barbie doll advertisement from a few years ago. And I want you to just take a minute and try to identify the high register words in this paragraph, in these three paragraphs, in this excerpt. So hit pause, try to identify the high register words, and then come back and we'll resume. And so you can see here that, I think to a large, first of all, hopefully you identified the high register words. And now what we'll do is use blue to indicate the words that came from the French in this excerpt. And my guess is that you'll notice a high correlation between your identification of high register words and the French borrowings in this case, right? Not all, but most. For instance, it's not the term colors doesn't strike me as a high register word. It happens to be a French word. But almost every other word that is from the French, except maybe colors and around, are high register words. And so there's this interesting sort of cultural correspondence to our register in English as it's expressed today. So now we're going to look at, let's see, how are we doing here? This is a comparison by situation. So you've got Lyndon Baines Johnson speaking at an informal dinner using low register language. He's talking about Vietnam War at this point, right? So Kennedy has been assassinated. LBJ takes on the burden of the presidency as well as the Vietnam War. And in the informal setting, he says, "I want to stop the killing." Sorry, I want the killing to stop. Then notice the shift when he's addressing the nation. I am taking the first step to de-escalate the conflict. We are substantially reducing the present level of hostilities. And so you have all sorts of high register words here to signify that kind of authority through formality. And I know you would see the difference in these two examples. Kind of qualitatively, you'd be able to see that the second one is more formal and more polished. But you might not know why, right? And I don't want you to have to reach for kind of vague language when there is a clear set of technical terms to describe these sorts of shifts, and this one being register. Here's a good example of a student, who doesn't have strong control of his register. And you can see it here in the blue, right? So it opens very high register just with the title and then the first signal verb in an activity theoretic account of early quantum development. So what is the reader thinking right away? The reader is thinking, this is high register language. This is formal, technical, scientific discourse. So the reader is creating an expectation of what will follow. Writer Gail Thorson contends. That signal verb, contends, is very high register, right? So again, it's further consolidating an expectation of formality for the reader. That George Gamow couldn't believe it when he first laid eyes on. Well, that's straight low register, right? That's like street talk right there. Couldn't believe it when he first laid eyes on. So, and then back up to high register, Max Planck's notion of discrete packets of radiation called quanta. So this is a classic case just in academic writing of a student, trying to use conventional academic writing. He has contends as a good signal verb. He has a lot of the language here in a consistent register voice, but that couldn't believe it when he first laid eyes on has got to go, right? It's just, I'm assuming this writer didn't do this for some strategic, creative, reason, and so you wouldn't call this an effective use of register. There's an unconscious register shift probably here. If you wanted to sort of smooth out that register, you could do something like this. Contends that George Gamow grew suspicious when he first read of blah, 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 right? And that's got a reasonably high register to it to match the rest of the sentence. So you've got strong. In other words, there's what the check mark in green is indicating is that it's consistent register. Oh, this is one I think, yeah, here's a good one. This is from Creative Writing. At his first request, I respectfully declined. At his second, I insisted. High register language. Formal, erudite, polished. At his third, I told him to piss off. A serious drop in register, obviously, but for a reason. This is done intentionally in this case. And now back up to the higher language, higher register, and decided that I would forever despise him, not because he had been vulgar, but because his persistence had summoned the vulgar in me, right? So this person continually kind of, dogmatically continued a request of the narrator. She began presuming, let's see, does it ever recognize? No, I don't think the gender of the narrator is listed, so it could be a man or a woman or any sort of gender identification here. But the narrator, right, at first respectfully declines, at second insists, but finally that narrator, the kind of diplomacy is worn thin, and he or she tells the person to piss off. And then in the language, of course, it returns right back to that high register. And so, right, this is done for there's a kind of creative value here, right, that shows in the drop in register, the drop in the bodily comportment of the narrator. And then she or he resumes a kind of composure, just as the register resumes a kind of high register value. Okay, so that's a really good creative use of register. Typical effects. Take those effects with a grain of salt. Register is used for a million reasons. These were the best. These were the most common I could commit myself to putting to this presentation, right? And so oftentimes low register conveys simplicity. There's a directness. It's oftentimes, though not always, sincere. Certainly it registers, class markers, right? When you're writing, when you say something like, we was robbed, or we ain't got no, when you put that in the dialogue, in the mouth of a character, the reader will clearly infer some sort of class marker there, unless otherwise indicated. High register is oftentimes a bit more detached. There's an elegance, a sophistication, of course, a formality there, and a different set of class markers. Okay, on to branching. This is really helpful for anyone's writing. I hope so. Branching, we're only going to cover left and right. There's such a thing as middle branching, and I'm not going to address it because it's not as common and it doesn't give you as much, it doesn't lead to as much improvement in your writing as the left and right will. Branching is just a way to get away from writing short, choppy base clause sentences over and over, right? You want to add some flow to your writing. And so what you can do is learn to well modify your base clauses. A left modifying clause is called a left branch. And here's an example. So I want to say a couple of things. G.A. Shot is the subject of the sentence, and that's what I want to talk about. But before I get to G.A. Shot, I want the reader to know that G.A. Shot was one of Nagaoka, a different physicist, one of Nagaoka's severest critics. Now I could say that by saying, G.A. Shot was one of Nagaoka's severest critics, period. G.A. Schott probably carried the tradition, blah, 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 right? But there's a kind of clunky repetition there that isn't needed. A way out of that would be to just left branch the first modifier. One of Nagaoka's severest critics, comma, G.A. Schott probably carried, on we go. And that lets the reader know that G.A. Schott is one of Nagaoka's severest critics. Now, there's a regional dialect issue here, and you might find if you're from Western New York or upstate New York, you might find that this left branch doesn't sit well with your ear, and you might want to have the word as in front of the one. And that's fine. As one of Nagaoka's severest critics, comma, G.A. Schott proudly carried, blah, blah, blah. Fine. That works too. It doesn't change the point that it's a left branch. But it is not it's a dialect issue, and so it's not required. That as is certainly not required. So you can simply use one of Nagaoka's severest critics. I'm from the Midwest and spent a lot of time on the West Coast, and so that as is not doesn't sound quite right to my ear. It's just a regional difference. But either one is fine. Okay, so that's how you modify the base clause. Base clause starts with G.A. Schott, and you modify it with a left branch. Okay. Here's the right branch. Now you start with the base clause in this case. Few theories gained assent without the approval of G.A. Schott. Okay, but now G.A. Schott's at the end of the sentence. And I want to say further, I want to modify G.A. Schott further by articulating more description about him. And so I can do so by having a comma and then add a modifying clause at the end. And that's the right branch. Okay. Now in these cases, it's important to think about modification. The left branch almost always needs to modify the subject of the sentence. One of Nagaoka's severest critics, comma, whoever that severest critic is needs to be in the subject slot of that first sentence. And the right branch frequently needs to modify the object of the sentence, in this case again, G.A. Schott. And when you don't do that, you end up with mismodification in your writing, and that's something you need to work on. You want to continue to learn how to branch, but then also learn to smooth out the mismodifications that sometimes crop up as you practice. Before we get on to that, branching is a great way to be concise and have flowing language because you're not repeating yourself. You have what a lot of people would call a high information density in your writing, and that's important for information designers, right? You want to say a lot in a few words, and you want to say it well in a way that doesn't lead to low reading comprehension. Branching is one of the top ways to do that. Here's a good example of where it's really needed. I used to read these all the time when I worked in Toronto and California, hiring folks into positions. And the idea would be this. Obviously, I wasn't hiring from Niagara University, but the sentence structure was the same. Here's your cover letter. You apply. You're graduating from school. You've got a cover letter for some prized job you want. This is not what you don't want to do this. I am a recent graduate of NU, period. I am writing to apply for the position of Associate Marketing Coordinator, period. This position was posted in LinkedIn last week. So as soon as you see two or more sentences starting I am, something like that, or any noun, really, think to yourself, please, do yourself a favor, think to yourself, let's try to branch this and see if it sounds better. It might not. Sometimes it won't work. Oftentimes it will, okay? And so just like in the previous case, what we can do here, actually, we can do a double branch. You can have a left, a base clause, and a right branch. And that's what I have here, right? So I've got, a recent graduate of Niagara University, comma, that's the left branch. Or if you want, you could have as a recent graduate of Niagara University, comma, I am writing to apply for the position of Associate Marketing Coordinator, comma, which was posted on LinkedIn last Wednesday. You've got great flow, great structure, high information density. This is a well-written opening sentence on your cover letter. I've already discussed that left branches typically modify the subject of the base, right branches modify the object. And so this is a diagram that hopefully helps you see what we're talking about, right? that left branch has to modify the subject, the right branch, oftentimes the object. And so now you can see the relationship between branching and voice. Remember when I was talking about active and passive voice? I said we're going to come back to this because when we get to branching, you'll see the relationship between branching and voice. And the relationship is, if you want to have a long right branch that modifies something, that something needs to be in the object slot of the base clause. And so you might need, in the case of the ball was, what was it? The ball was kicked by Bill or something, right? So you've got, instead of, if you want that right branch to modify Bill, you would need to write the base clause as the ball was kicked by Bill, comma, who is Leslie's father or something. You couldn't use the active voice of Bill kicked the ball, because if Bill kicked the ball, Bill is in the subject slot of the base clause, and you wouldn't be able to modify Bill well in that case using the right branch. In that case, you'd have to use the left branch. So you decide what you want at the front and the back of that base clause based on how you want to modify it with these branches. And when you do that, you oftentimes flip the voice. Here's a good example of mismodification. After eating my breakfast, my mom gave me a ride to school. Now, what this student is probably trying to say is that, let's say it's a guy, that he ate his breakfast and then his mom gave him a ride to school. But the way this left branch is modifying the subject, it literally means that his mom ate his breakfast and then his mom gave him a ride to school, right? After eating my breakfast, well, the question is, who ate my breakfast? And the answer will be always in the subject slot. Who is in the subject slot? The mom. So that literally means my mom ate my breakfast and then gave me a ride to school. And you can bet court case after court case will uphold that interpretation. So be careful of mismodification when you're writing in a professional setting, right? These things do matter. You can fix it a million ways. One is to put the right subject in the base clause, right? After eating my breakfast, I was given a ride to school by my mom. Now you have the same question. Well, who's eating my breakfast? Well, I am, and I'm in the subject slot, so that's proper modification. There would be other ways to fix it. I do offer one. Another way to fix it is just to modify that left branch so that it's not ambiguous who ate the breakfast. And this sentence works for that well too. After I ate my breakfast. So once you do that, there's no question of, this is not a case of the left branch modifying the mom in this case, right? And so I ate my breakfast. It's not a question of who ate the breakfast. We're not looking to the subject to answer that, and away we go. Here's another good one. I actually took this from a publication. I think it was the New York Times. This Silicon Valley engineer was writing, and I was surprised to see such an obvious mismodification. So they're out there. Same thing though, right? You've got the base clause is my skills and experience are in high demand, and that left branch is a veteran Silicon Valley developer. The problem is, it's the person who is the veteran Silicon Valley developer. But this sentence claims that the skills and experience are a veteran Silicon Valley developer. It just doesn't work, right? So what you really need in there is a person for the subject slot in the base clause. Something like that. A veteran of Silicon Valley a veteran of Silicon, no, that's not going to work. Oh, that of shouldn't be there. That's a mistake. This of it should be a veteran Silicon Valley developer, comma. I have a set of skills and experiences that are in high demand. Forget this of. My bad. Okay, so then it would work. Because now you have I being properly modified by a veteran Silicon Valley developer. Honed through years of experience in the Silicon Valley. Oh, and this would be a way to modify the skills. If you really want the skills in the subject of that base clause, then you could write it this way, among others. Okay, so you want my skills are in high demand. That's the point. So now what you don't want what you want to do in that left branch is modify the skills. It was the skills that were honed through years of experience, right? So that works. Honed through years of experience in the Silicon Valley, my skills are in high demand. That works too. Okay, I've already discussed this a few minutes ago, but we'll just run through it, right? So again, left branch in this case needs to modify John. Right branch should modify ball. And so this is where you might flip it, right? You might be like, oh, okay, I want active voice, passive voice, because it puts John and ball in the different slots, and therefore you can modify them with right and left branches differently. I hope you see what's going on there. If you don't, ask me on Thursday. This is important. Enough with branching. Zeugma is a less known stylistic device. It's got a lot of power to it, especially in creative writing. It's the artful use of a verb with two or more objects in a way that requires the reader to reinterpret the nature of the verb on the second and later go-round, right? So the reader encounters this verb, thinks the reader understands the use of the verb, continues reading the sentence, and has to then reinterpret that verb in a new way. It's oftentimes the same exact instance of a verb, but it could be two different verbs, the same verb twice in the sentence. So examples: at the cottage last weekend, he caught 3 trout and a cold. So when the reader gets to he caught and then 3 trout, the reader has a certain understanding of the use of the verb caught here. Then when the reader gets to and a cold, the reader has to return. It doesn't make sense in that same semantic field. So the reader has to return to the verb and say, oh, caught now means something different, because you catch a fish differently than you catch a cold. It's a different sense of the word, right? And so that's the use of zeugma. A few other cases here, right? If we don't hang together, we shall surely hang separately. The first case, hang, is meant in terms of like solidarity, right? If we don't stick together. And in the second case, of course, it's a form of execution. Third case, you are free to execute your laws and your citizens as you see fit. So again, now execute is the different, is the double entendre, right? So you execute your laws. In that case, execute means just enact, right? Enforce. But obviously, to execute your citizens means something entirely different. So it's a play, it's a verb play there. Case from Alexander Pope. You need to know in this case, T was pronounced te in the time of Alexander Pope's writing. Hear thou, great Anna, whom 3 realms obey, dost sometimes counsel take and sometimes te. And right, so you just have a double use of the verb take here. You take counsel a different way than you take t, in his case, te. And so that bifurcating meaning of the verb take in that case makes this zeugma. As you might imagine, there's a kind of poetic effect here. And again, if we go back to thinking about pacing your reader, you want your reader to read with flow at times, and then at times you want the reader to pull back on the reins and have to sit with a sentence and meditate on that sentence, and a way to get that student to, or that reader to slow the pace of reading and reinterpret or pause. We've talked about other ways in Lecture 1. Another way to do so is through the strategic use of zeugma. And so it can be used to pace the reader, to provide a kind of clever emphasis through this multivalent or poetic effect. The last 2 devices of this lecture, as well as for the introduction of the course, go hand in hand. Synecdoche and metonymy are similar, okay? And so you might want to pair those up in your notes. Synecdoche is when you just substitute a a part for a whole, that's the most common case, and sometimes the whole for a part. So whenever you're referring to in your writing, if you just refer to it by pointing out a part of it, that's when you're using synecdoche. Okay, but it has to be a part of the object you're referring to. So these examples I've given, these four, are all synecdoche because in the first case, all hands on deck. Well, literally what we mean, right, are people, all people on deck. And hands are the relevant part of the person in this expression, and so they've just referred to their hands. But so it's synecdoche because it's a part-whole relationship. Hands are indeed literally part of the person, and so it's synecdoche. An incongruous pattern of haute couture. Oh, patron, sorry. That's why it didn't make sense. An incongruous patron of haute couture. Haute couture just means high society fashion, if you're not familiar with that phrase in French. An incongruous patron of haute couture. She wears Louis Vuitton and Rolex. So I guess the incongruity here is that Louis Vuitton is in a higher stratosphere than, or strata than Rolex, apparently, or they're just of different communities. So there's some sort of incongruity there between Vuitton and Rolex that is not needed to know whether this is synecdoche or not. What you do need to know it's synecdoche is what they literally mean is that this person, of course, is wearing the clothes created by Louis Vuitton, I suppose, and the Rolex watch created by the brand. It's the brand. That's the better way to put it. These are brands of clothing, not the clothing themselves, right? And so it's a kind of shortcut. She wears Louis Vuitton. Well, of course, if you translate this literally, it's going to no one's wearing Louis Vuitton and no one's wearing the brand Rolex. You're wearing the products of these entities, and so there's a kind of whole part relationship here instead of part whole, right? And so that would be the case of making it synecdoche. I think that one actually you could argue that it's either synecdoche or metonymy. You could argue that one either way, depending on how you frame it. But as long as, and we haven't gotten to metonymy yet, so I won't belabor that point. The FBI stormed the compound. That's a case of synecdoche, not part to whole, but whole to part, right? Because the FBI is an agency. It doesn't do really much of anything as an agency, right? It's in this case, well, it can, but it doesn't in this case. In this case, it's people who work for the FBI stormed the compound. But you didn't refer to those people. You referred to the larger whole, the organization. The FBI stormed the compound. And so that's synecdoche because you didn't say, a way to get rid of the synecdoche would be, right, FBI agents stormed the compound. That would be literal and not synecdoche. The last case I offer, just in the same mindset of the fact that these stylistic devices, are not sequestered to natural language. We're not just talking about English or French, right? We're talking about sculpture, architecture, music, and we're also talking about mathematics. In this example I offer last here is a case from my own research, where I, for a long time, studied the role of metaphor, analogy, synecdoche in physics. And so this, I argue, is a case of synecdoche because what Hantaro Nagaoka is doing here, he is simply proposing an equation that accounts for the kinematics, which would be the quality of motion of electrons around the nucleus of an atom. Now he's presenting this as a theory of as a theory of the atom, right? As the atomic theory, and it's presented in that way to a lot of people, and it's known as the Saturnian theory of atomic structure. And so, and Nagaoka doesn't really take pains to clarify the situation. What he really is doing, though, he's only describing one part of atomic dynamics, and that is how electrons orbit the nucleus and the way in which their vibrations account for certain qualities. So he's not really offering a full account of the atom. He's simply offering a partial account and kind of leaving it ambiguous as to whether it is in fact partial or whole. He knows it's not whole, but he's leaving it for the community to decide how much to validate this theory. And G.A. Schott calls him on it. And he calls him on it for the very reason I say. Schott says, this equation might well account for one part of atomic dynamics, but that's pretty trivial because it doesn't make sense when you try to consider the nature of the atom as a whole. And so in this case, Hontaro Nagaoka's mathematics is a case of synecdoche. Last is metonymy. Oh yeah, I think the blue just indicates where this synecdoche is located. Oh, sorry, yeah, typical effect, highlighting. You're just highlighting a piece, oftentimes in the part-to-whole relationship. You're just highlighting the important piece of the object. There's no need to refer to the whole object, like in all hands on deck, right? It's like all personnel on deck, but really what we need some work to be done, and that's signified by hands. Okay. And again, with the FBI one, that would be the opposite, whole to part. You might be like, yeah, we don't care that people stormed the compound. What's important to know is that they're part of the FBI. That's the important part. And so the typical effect here is you're highlighting the piece of the object that you find important. But I'll say one last time, synecdoche is always referring to either part to whole or whole to part relationships, as opposed to metonymy. Metonymy is a close cousin to synecdoche. Metonymy is when you substitute an associated term without implicating a part-to-whole or whole-to-part relationship. Okay? So let's look at an example. The ham sandwich is ready for his bill. You imagine this as like a waiter in a diner, and some guy orders, some customer orders a ham sandwich. So someone walking by, another waiter might say, yeah, the guy in the corner is ready for his bill, but you can make a better emphasis, you can more quickly identify that person in this culture by just saying the ham sandwich is ready for his bill. Obviously it's not literally true, but what have you done? You've identified something of relevance that is associated with the customer, and you've chosen to use that identified term, that associated term, rather than the actual customer, right? So you've got the ham sandwich is ready for his bill. Now, that's a lot like all hands on deck, which was an example of synecdoche, right? But the ham sandwich is ready for his bill is metonymy, because this is why. Literally, the ham sandwich is not part of the customer. It is simply associated with the customer. And that's the only difference between synecdoche and metonymy. In the case of all hands on deck, the hands are literally part of the person working on deck. And since it's literally part of the person, it's a literal part-whole relationship, it's synecdoche. Here, the ham sandwich is not part of the customer, but simply associated with the customer, and that's what makes it metonymy. It's going to be a long flight. Have another glass. Well, what you really are saying is probably have another glass of beer or wine, something like that. But you didn't say that. You used a figure of speech to identify something associated with the beer or wine. Let's say it's wine. So instead of saying have more wine, which would be literal, you said have another glass. The glass is not part of the wine, right? But it is heavily associated with the wine, and so it's metonymic in this case. The White House today announced that it would begin talks with Moscow. What do we have going on here? So I guess the key here is what literally is the case is, I suppose, the speech right now, an individual in the office, right? The press agent announced that the United States executive branch would begin talks with the executive branch, the federal government of Moscow, something like that. But you didn't get that specific and literal, right? The White House oftentimes stands in for the executive branch. And in this case, the person who announced it isn't mentioned at all, but is probably works for the White House. So there are a bunch of associations going on here that allow us to make sense of that very clearly because we're used to abstraction and generalization and close associations. But these are figures of speech and not literal, right? Because, of course, the White House doesn't literally announce anything. And so you know there's some sort of non-literal figuration going on. And in this case, it's metonymic because it's that associated term. Same thing with Moscow, right? It's Moscow's a city. They're not beginning talks with a city. In this case, Moscow is closely represented with the government of Russia, and that's what it's standing in for. So you've got a double metonymy going on here. I do believe, let's see if that's it. Again, like synecdoche, metonymy typically has the effect of highlighting on an aspect of the object rather than offering the literal identification of the object at hand. And they're subtle, but again, it's something to be, if you care about your writing, if you care about teaching writing, these terms are important to understand, and just read with this awareness, and it'll change your appreciation of reading, I believe, and clearly your control over your own writing. That concludes the video, and we'll see you on Thursday. I forgot to include this little worksheet at the end of the video lecture number 2, so I'll add it here. This is a good exercise to do as a writer. As you're writing and you're trying to think of how to compose sentences, it's sometimes handy to just flip the voice back and forth, or especially if you're revising your existing draft or giving comments to another person. If you don't really know where to start in terms of revision, it's not working the way it's working, but you're not sure what to do. Any of these devices really are a place to, well, many of the devices are a place to start. Like you could look at nominals and say, oh, do I have too many nominals? Do I have not enough? You could look at parallel structure. And another thing you could look at is voice. And so, it's hard to say whether passive or active in any given instance is the better choice. But so what we'll do here is just flip the voice and use that as the exercise. So in this first case, the 54 EMS circuit must be activated no later than 11 p.m. nightly. We know this is passive voice because someone needs to be activating this circuit every night. And that someone is not in the subject slot. What needs to be activated, in other words, the object of the activation, is in the subject slot. So whoever's doing this activation isn't in the sentence. And this is a case where I mentioned, so the voice is passive, and this is a case of that responsibility avoidance, or aversion to responsibility can happen, right? Because we don't know who is supposed to do this. This is the kind of work that is frequently revised into the active voice for a number of reasons, one of which is so that the agent responsible for completing this is named. So if we're going to flip the voice of this sentence, what would we do here? We'd have to invent some agent who needs to do this work. So it might say the third shift supervisor must activate the 54 EMS circuit no later than 11 p.m. nightly. So now so this was passive, and now you have active, right? Because you've got someone needs to do this activation. That someone is the third shift supervisor, and the third shift supervisor is in the subject slot, so it's active. So we flipped the voice there. Here's our old case of the reclusive Mullah Omar. So right away we know it's active voice. Someone did some telling. The person who did the telling was Mullah Omar. Mullah Omar is in the subject slot, so it's active voice. If we were to flip it and make it passive, let's see what we would do here. We would need working level state officials, we're told. So you would go like this would be one way. So August 22nd, a working level State Department official was told by Mullah Omar that the strikes were counterproductive. So now you have, again, same verb, someone's doing the telling, same person, Mullah Omar, is still doing the telling, but he is not in the subject slot of the sentence. Official is, and so this is passive. So you've got active up here, active up here, and passive here. Okay, what do we have here? Clams are eaten by otters, and then a right branch. So so someone's doing some eating. Looks like the otters are doing the eating, and they're not in the subject slot. So it's passive voice. This sentence is passive. If I want to flip it into active voice, I need the otters in the subject slot doing the eating. Otters eat clams. Now you've got active voice instead of passive. But notice now you can't do that ending. You can't have this right branch. Because this right branch modifies the clams, but it's not the clams that are the charming creatures that are decimating Alaska's shellfish population. It's the otters. And so what you need to do, what would work if this were a quiz would be to just delete it. That's fine. A better way to do it would be to make it as a left branch. Something like that. That would work, because that shows that you understand mismodification and proper modification. Those charming creatures that are decimating Alaska's shellfish population, otters, eat clams. It doesn't quite make sense. It's not a great sentence, but at least you have the right modification. Or as I said, this would be fine as well. Okay. What's the voice here? Until the earthquake, that side of the iceberg had never been seen. Someone is doing some seeing. Who's doing the seeing? We don't know. Since we don't know, they can't possibly be in the subject slot. So it's passive. Passive voice. How you would make it active voice is you'd have to invent a subject to be in the subject slot who is seeing the iceberg. That side of the iceberg. So until the earthquake, visitors had never seen that side of the iceberg. Something like that. Or, tourists. Or let's do that. Tourists or town people or whatever. Until the earthquake, tourists had never seen that side of the iceberg. So there's some seeing going on, right? The tourists are the ones doing the seeing. They are in the subject slot, yes, and so that's active voice. Finally, Tim sold his house along with his... Okay, so you can stop right there. You can stop right here almost. I stopped here and realized, right, the voice is active. Someone's doing some selling. Someone's selling something. That someone is Tim, and he's in the subject slot. So this is active. Easy way to make it passive would be the house and the rare Franklin Mint collection were sold by Tim. You can do that if you want. You don't need to buy Tim. To Hakeem for $1. Now you've got same thing. Somebody's doing some selling, but they're not in the subject slot. They're here. So it's passive. Or they're nowhere and it's still passive. Either one of those would work fine. Okay, so that's a little bit of practice with voice. Again, bring your questions on Thursday if you have them. Thanks.